The port of Stanley lies nestled in the shadow of the Nut, a unique geological feature formed by volcanic action millions of years ago. Admired today for its picturesque location and old world atmosphere, its founding was for much more prosaic reasons. Till the 1960s, it was the only deep water harbour on the northwest coast. The bay is sheltered from winds from every direction but the east. Gales from that direction periodically wrought havoc during its first 80 years of existence. The first breakwater was opened to great fanfare in 1905. This was to suffer storm damage and to be rebuilt and extended several times over the ensuing years. Another feature of Tasmania's northwest coast is the number of small river ports. Before the coming of the railway, when all goods were moved slowly by bullock wagon and horse teams, these small ports were the centre of trade for their various districts. River ports included Montague, Smithton, Wynyard and Ulverston, with Devonport further east. There were also jetties at various bays including Tema, Marrawar, Rocky Cape and Burnie, while at Woolnorth, wool was loaded directly off the beach. Produce included potatoes, swedes, dairy products and timber, both split and sawn. Cargoes were sailed in small craft to mainland ports, principally Melbourne, while some produce was taken to Stanley for transshipment on larger vessels to the mainland. Stanley's strategic importance grew with the coming of the railway in 1916. It was a busy and thriving port where seaman and farmer met, each dependent on the other.
From end to end, from the wharf gates right down, only the railway line was left clear of the potatoes and carrots and swedes that used to be carried in by trucks and then on the train.
The trucks used to come in and they'd be lined up from the wharf gate. The weighbridge was at the wharf gate. There'd be trucks from the wharf gate a mile back through the town, bumper to bumper, waiting to go through. They had to go through and be weighed, and then they had to go to the inspection shed for the department, the inspectors to have a look at the stuff. So there was always a line-up. And during that period also, the train would run from Trawata and would start at Trawata and come down through Orangetown. So every time there was a shipment, there'd be about 2,000 bags of produce would come in by train. Nothing for potatoes and sweets to be stacked one end of the Stanley Wharf to the other, and you've probably seen some of the old photos, but 4,000 and 5,000 bags at a time, which would be, 2,000 or 3,000 tonnes. And they had a covered wharfway there, that would be full, and then they'd be out in the open. And it was a pretty big going port for those few years.
Stanley was the business hub of the district, sporting 3 hotels, 3 banks, 3 butchers and 2 grocers, as well as other shops. As the trade increased, so did the size of vessels employed. As well as shipping away primary produce, general freight for all the district's needs was imported. Some vessels ran to a timetable and traded on the same run for decades.
Yes, well, it's a great saying too. It's on the Waniora. The Waniora traded every week. I don't know whether it was a Saturday or a Friday. She'd come back here to Stanley from Melbourne. She was a Holloman's boat. And then there was the Larana and the Marrawar. I think they were both Holloman's boats. But they were regular traders.
For eons, the northwest coast had been shrouded in forests of huge eucalypts, which had to be cleared to establish farms. Millions of tonnes of timber were split into palings and shingles and sawn into scantlings. Much of Adelaide and Melbourne were built of Tasmanian sawn hardwood frames and fenced with Tasmanian split palings. There were several mills in the district, including the Stanley Sawmilling Company, sited under the shadow of the Nut.
It used to be packed full from end to end, and the train line used to run right to the end of the breakwater in those days.
Vessels of all descriptions were employed in the timber trade, including little sailing ketches and schooners, and later larger steamships and motor ships. The smaller vessels were collectively and affectionately known as the Mosquito Fleet. Curmandy was the largest of the Mosquito Fleet and a regular trader to Stanley over a long period. Curmandy was built on the banks of the Curmandy River in southern Tasmania and launched in 1920. At 350 tonnes, she was the largest scow-type vessel built in Australia and the only vessel rigged as a four-masted schooner.
She'd run out of time, but she was still doing the job. They used to put the timber in there a board at a time. Would take it'd take anything up to a week. In Stanley, to load her up, they'd put the packs of timber down, they'd take them to pieces and lay floors of timber. And then same thing happened in Melbourne when they went there, but she was on the run for a lot of years.
Like plenty of timber, but she's loaded. Yeah, so old railway trucks would be coming down the wharf here day after day, just every bit stacked by hand. Only when they wouldn't stack it, when they got the hole full up the wings and that sort of thing. And then they'd just tip that into the hole, the last parts of it there, and just whip the strops off. And that's the only part that wasn't stacked. Then they'd start stacking on deck, then one piece after another. She's put in there. So you can just imagine what it's like when you got that down here about that far for water to get out through the scuppers underneath where they got the timber, that one. A piece lying across to stack it on so you can get the strop underneath and that. Yeah, so she was like a big old log, the old Commandy. She was weighted down. I said the one sea just come on and the next one just roll straight on top and right around her. Nothing be walking around up to your knees in water on deck, where that timber wasn't. You used to have a place around by the after there in the gully, a bit down by the forecastle, and the rest of it was all timber. So there weren't many places for you to walk about. You had to walk across timber to go back up forward to the cabin. Yeah, see.
And there's one thing I remember, we was young fellas down there watching the Yarra, the freighter, the Yarra, and they misjudged it with the berthing of her, and she ran into the wharf, into the foreshore wharf, runs right through the wharf, and I can still see the 12 by 14 timbers under the wharf, crashed them and flying up in the air and everything. And then apparently they had trouble with the anchor winch, dropped the anchor. They dropped the anchor on the main road. Yes. And that boat, she was an old, a real old freighter. She wasn't welded, but riveted. She never even hardly scratched the paint off the boat.
Yeah.
No.
The Yarra came away unscathed, but the Curmandy was not so fortunate when she stranded on North Point near Stanley in 1957. She was under the command of Captain Jimmy O'Neill, who was relieving her long-time skipper Darcy Driscoll. O'Neill had already lost the Collie Boy at Woolnorth Point and the Aristides on Three Hummock Island.
The Commandy run down, she was due to berth at Stanley, and she came down and it was easterly gale, and she ran into the Three Hummocks in Chimney Corner. and laid the gale out. And then when the wind shifted to the north, he got underway and he came back to Stanley. And on the way, she hit that shallow patch just northwest of the beacon. There's a shallow patch out there with about 2.5 fathom on it. And apparently she hit and lost the rudder. And the head blew off and they couldn't handle her and she went ashore at the beacon at North Point.
Vain attempts were made to refloat Kurmandi by removing cargo into motor trucks at low tide and towing her off at high tide.
But it must be removed to help in any attempt at refloating. Waterside workers are called in to transfer the wheat to lorries, which will cart it to a dump above high water mark. A bulldozer is used to gouge out holes from the shingle at the stern of the Kurmandi and along the sides. The Devonport Marine Board tug tries to haul the stranded ship into deep water, while the fishing boats, VSP and Jean Nichols, stand by to lend assistance. Everything possible is done to drag the vessel off the shore. For the last time, the jigger sail is raised, and a 6-inch pump pours water from the hull, but all efforts are in vain. The Kurmandi will never sail again, and she is sold for scrap. Everything of value is stripped from her, and even the tall masts, which once made her a picture of beauty in full sail, are brought down with charges of gelignite. Finally, there is nothing left but the hull, and this must be destroyed by fire, to prevent it floating off and becoming a danger to navigation. A spectacular funeral pyre, glowing redly in the night sky, marks the end of one of the last auxiliary schooners.
Captain Bill Barrett, who had sailed with Captain O'Neill as mate in Loprina, has his own ideas of why the Kurmandi was wrecked.
He had bad eyesight. He never let on that he had bad eyesight, and when you sight anything, you say, you see that, you can see the land over there, Captain. Oh yes, he said, I've been watching that for half an hour. You knew what he had never seen it. He was dependent on you because he didn't. His sight, his distance sight was very bad. I could understand how he got ashore down at with the Kurmandi.
The bay at Stanley was a place of refuge from the westerly gales for craft bound along the coast to the west, whether making for the islands, the west coast, Melbourne or Adelaide. Unfortunately, it could also be a trap if a gale sprang up from the east, which is not unusual in this area, putting a vessel on a lee shore. If anchors did not hold, they'd be blown ashore, as these photos of Wild Wave and Alvina testify. Not surprisingly, vessels of the Mosquito Fleet often found themselves at sea in wild weather, which could lead to some interesting experiences. Des Garced was engineer in the Kurmandi in the early 1950s.
So we had a few, but never any really startling as far as accidents or anything goes. It was many times we just, water just, well, you couldn't have it was running in the cabins and everything else. Skylights on the Kurmandi, you used to have to close them down because she was like a big old log. And see it hit her and just roll on board, and by the time the next one comes, she hadn't shaken it off. It was all stacked right up to the bulwarks to the gunwale with timber as far as you could see. And used to have the skylights there in the engine room, that part of it, and she'd just pull up there and then start to go in the engine room. So that's when you start to worry a little bit, get all pumps going and goodness knows what. Well, yeah, it's all right if they didn't block up, but...
Des was fortunate that by the time he sailed in Kermandy, she was fitted with engine-driven pumps. When Clyde Mackay was in her 15 years earlier, pumping was done by hand.
We were out in all weather. There was no wheelhouse on the old Commandy. We struck one bad trip. We ran right back from nearly Kangaroo Island in South Australia way back to Stanley, and I think we put half a Bass Strait through that deck pump. You pumped the full 4 hours while you did an hour and 20 minutes at the wheel, and then the rest of your 4 hours was on the pump. Put muscles on muscles, I can assure you.
Small ships carried timber continually from Tasmania to mainland ports for 150 years. During the mid-1900s, some of the vessels engaged included the Alma Dopel, Defender, Lilita, Lita May, Aristides, Melita, Kumonderi and Laprina. Little ketches deep loaded with a deck cargo of timber were at the mercies of seas breaking on board. Bill Barrett spent some time in the Melita.
Well, we ran into a gale and the sea came over that and washed it into the starboard rigging. And we all got called out. And this timber was speared through the starboard rigging up forward up there. And that had broken all the lashings and that. Well, anyway, we had a lot of it went over the side, and then we had to turn around and we worked, I think, about 4 or 5 hours wet through and getting this timber out of the rigging. Starboard rigging and getting it back on board. It was in a big heap on the ship. We got to Melbourne. The bloke that owned it, he didn't get much of it.
Reliance on sail had reduced in the old ketches during the 1930s and 40s as larger diesel motors were installed. However, in vessels such as the Lita May, Defender and Margaret Thwaites, sail provided as much power as the motor, providing there was sufficient wind. Bill was in Lita May on the Smithton-Melbourne run in the late 1940s.
Oh yes, we'd set sail. Yes, Mick Butfield, he was a sailing master. There's no get away from that. Old Mick used to race the Kumanderi, but the Kumanderi had a bigger motor, you see, and she used to get. When we had plenty of wind, we'd get away from her to drop her over the stern. Couldn't see her then, but because the wind would die out, and of course the Kumanderi had a bigger engine, and she would overhaul it. Oh, they used to be keen.
There was great competition to make the fastest time across Bass Strait. The comings and goings and voyage times of the Mosquito fleet were written up in Melbourne newspapers of the day, particularly the Argus. The record under sail is considered to be held by the ketch Defender, which in 1923 sailed from Smithton to Port Phillip Heads in 18.5 hours. Passing the steamer Hillmeads on the way, she was under the able command of Captain Walter Leggett. Walter Hill sailed with Captain Leggett years later.
He stood on the wharf over here at Smithton. I forget what the other sailing boat was, but the Hillmeads was steamer, and he saw the Hillmeads go out over the bar. He said, and then he would let go in the Defender and away he went. And he said we had a southeaster all the way across.
The base for the Mosquito fleet in Melbourne was at the Little Dock, a cove in the north bank of the Yarra River, about where the Spencer Street Bridge crosses today. The only landmark recognisable in this photo is the Rober Tea building standing in Clarendon Street, South Melbourne. The ketch Defender and the schooner Alma Dopel are the only members of the Mosquito fleet still afloat today. Built on the banks of the Bellinger River in northern New South Wales and launched in 1903, the Alma d'Opel is an excellent example of a coastal schooner of the period. The history of European settlement on Hunter and Three Hummock Islands runs somewhat parallel. They were both settled spasmodically from about the 1850s before being permanently settled by the late 1800s. From 1932 to 1951, the lease of Three Hummock Island was held by Bill and Sis Nichols, who owned trading vessels. It was they who carried out major improvements, including building a stone jetty, a second house, and pasture improvement. Mrs. Nichols appears to have been the main driver of the partnership, both at sea and ashore.
Ma Nichols was a terrific organiser, and she looked after everyone and fed everyone very, very well. And you sort of felt at home with her all the time, yes. But she was in her own way. Oh, she was bossy, but she sort of got over it in so much as she looked after you, yes. But she could get the best out of everyone. She could.
She'd work my crockies, slashing the tracks and everything, and work like a blasted man, she would. Yes, go. Just beautiful to see her working, and she expected everybody else to do the same, you know.
Walter Hill worked on the island in 1940, milking cows, driving the bullock team, and keeping the wallabies down using horses, dogs and snares.
I reckon 30 would have been the average for, you catch, and the dogs would bring them to you, and then you tie them in the saddle, gut them sometimes too, but no, you used to do a terrible lot of that. For dogs, mate.
What about the skins?
Skins were pegged out, yeah. Yeah, they were pegged out on, and later on we built a shed, and that shows up on that map out there, and that was specially made. It was heavy timber, recycled timber from the boats and that, and thick, so that when you tapped the nail, it didn't spring. It was very particular, Les was. And 16 dogs they had there at the time.
Max Hardy also spent time on the island when he first left school.
He used to plough the fields. A bloke with the name of Tom Moore. He used to do on the single moldboard plough, and we ploughed the top of the Three Hummock Island up what they call the bullock paddock. And I used to drive the 4 bullocks hooked to the plough, and I used to drive the bullocks and he used to guide the plough. And it was a very roots of trees on the thing, and we very, very often hooked a tree root, and that would upend the plough and everything. And because bullocks, when they hook onto anything, they're not like a horse, they don't stop, they put the pressure on. And I've thrown him for yards out across the field. Yes, I remember those times. But they were good times, and that was around about the time when the Aristides was wrecked at the Three Hummocks. Apparently she was en route from Melbourne via the Three Hummocks to pick up cattle, and she also had a lot of general cargo bound for Tasmania. Because in those days there was nothing come to Burnie much or anywhere. Stanley was the hub of the whole district, and she was loaded with general cargo, but was picking up cattle on the way. And they got tangled up with the rocks there, and that's where she was wrecked. The Aristides, what was. She was one of Holloman's boats at the time.
Who was the skipper?
Jimmy O'Neill, old Jimmy O'Neill. The locals on the Highland, but there was, I think there was about 15 or 18 people on the island at that time. Old Ma used to congregate them from somewhere. And I remember very clearly, they particularly Nestle's condensed milk. There was boxes and cans of it hidden under the rocks all over the island. Yes. Yes, it was but it was a good experience for me then down there, but then I came back.
Captain Bill Nichols had begun his trading career soon after the First World War in a little cutter named Farley. In 1927, he had the larger ketch Lady Jean, built at Stanley by Edward Higgs, in which he traded throughout the Bass Strait Islands. In 1936, the Nichols had the larger motor vessel Lady Flinders built for them at Ned Jack's shipyard in Launceston. After trading in her for 2 years, the Nichols sold her to their opposition, William Holliman and Sons, under whose ownership she was wrecked on Three Hummock Island on her first voyage.
Dark night, bad night, and Merv Goss, he was when I first went to the hummocks. Merv Goss was on the boat with Mr. Nichols. And of course I got to talk to Merv, and Merv told me what happened, Walter. He said it was easterly, but I'm damn stinking hard easterly. And she's on her way to King Island, and they mistook the Mermaid light for, they thought it was the Cuvier Bay light, you know, just, they just knew there was a light. And they run onto a, they thought that they was going right down round to the south part of the island, and they wasn't, they mistook the light. That's what Merv told me anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, my brother Ray was on her. He was the one that went ashore, got ashore. He was asleep in the forecastle when she went up, and he jumped out of bed and jumped on the forecastle, and there she was, the bow of the boat was right up against a big granite rock, and he jumped ashore. And after he jumped ashore, the sea washed her back about 50 feet. She washed back. And they got a line ashore to Ray, and that's how they all got ashore.
Upon the sale of the Lady Flinders, the Nichols put an order in for a smaller vessel from the famous Wilson Yard at Port Signet. This became the Jean Nichols, which they used for servicing their own Three Hummock, Hunter and King Islands. Walter Hill served in her for a short time when new, and after working in Devonport during the war years. He came back on board in 1947 as deckhand and eventually master, trading out of Stanley. At Three Hummock Island, the Jean Nichols could unload directly into the bullock wagon at low tide. In 1949, the Nichols sold the lease of Three Hummock to Perce Williams, who sold it on to John and Eleanor Alliston 2 years later. This was a dramatic change of career for John Alliston, who had seen a distinguished career as a Royal Naval Commander during the war years. Their eldest son, Robert, was only 4 when they arrived. Robert recalls.
Coming off the Jean Nichols with Walter handing me my tricycle and the bullock team coming down the track there, and it was all new. It was a fabulous adventure for us kids. My parents were looking for a place where they could be totally untrammelled by civilisation, which they put in inverted commas, and so they cited this ad in the paper for a caretaker in 1951, and my father came out and immediately knew it was the place where he wanted to be, and he was pretty sure that my mother would like it as well, which proved to be right, and we moved out there, managed for Perce Williams for a while. We convinced him to sell the island to at least to us, and within a couple of years we were sailing on our own there, and my parents couldn't have been happier.
At about the same time, and also with a young child, Pat and Trixie Maguire took over the lease of Hunter Island, just 5 miles away. As a young mother of 21, Trixie's introduction to island life was not such a happy one.
My furniture had gone ahead on the boat and taken everything and cleaned that old house up, and it was a terrible house. And I was left in Stanley till they got everything set up, or thought they did, but Mrs. Nichols insisted that the next trip they took that I went home, and Pat didn't even know I was coming. So we headed off, and Paddy was 12 months old. And my sister, Mrs. Nichols, more or less grabbed her off the wharf and said, "Come down, we'll bring you back tomorrow," to her, and go with Trixie to the island. So they landed us on the Cave Bay beach, and we had a pram with us. We were trying to pull Paddy up this sandy track she pointed which way we should go. And we met my husband, Pat, coming down on the tractor, and I reckon he thought he was seeing things. Here we were landed there. So that was my first trip to Hunters. So it was a terrible house. Gales lifted the lino up off your floor. They came home one day and found me sitting on the steps crying. I wasn't going home. I wasn't stopping. And that was because I couldn't get in the kitchen for the smoke. And anyway, I think before night time they had another extension on the chimney, and all was well again.
When the Maguires took over Hunter Island, the cattle had not been mustered for years. They were big and wild. Mr. Nichols and Walter had the task of loading them without a jetty or any mechanical aids whatever.
They had to bring them down and put them in a yard. And the cattle were that wild that he had to build a big sort of a yard on his trailer, and he could hold 3 steers at a time, bring them down and put them into a yard. Well, the yard only had a short race. We would come in with a boat, and we'd come in and we'd run a kedge anchor out just in case the wind wanted to blow us off. But then we had a line, and that line had to go into the shore to the end of the race, and then back to us, or we put it the other way first. It came from Pat out to us, and then back into Pat again. But we made sure that there was enough for us, and that's where we put the bowline on the bite, and they'd pull it in, and the bite of the rope, they would have 2 steers in the race with the head ropes on them, and they'd tie them then to the rope that they had from us, and then they'd let them out. And they don't just march along in pairs like bullocks, but they want to go one way go the other way.
Unlike this footage, taken by Alf Stackhouse of the Lady Gillian loading cattle at Erith Island in 1991, the boys on the Jean Nicol did not have the benefit of a winch to haul the cattle to the vessel, nor did they have a cage to swim them into for lifting aboard.
And we're out on the boat, Graham Branson and I most of the time, and we're pulling on it, pulling on the rope, and you pull on the rope until you get the cattle just about the point of got to swim.
Hauling the cattle to the water was only achieved by taking up slack on the rope as they surged towards the water and quickly taking turns around the bollard to hold them as they ran the other way. In this way, the cattle were gradually worked down the beach.
I would get down into the dinghy and Graham would give a couple of pulls and they'd be swimming. Mr. Nichols hang on the rope then, and we'd go in the dinghy, pull ourselves in on the line in the dinghy until we got to the cattle. We would undo them, tie them to the dinghy, and then pull ourselves back out to the boat.
2 slings were passed under each animal to be lifted aboard with the ship's gear.
We used to do that until with those cattle about 18 was a full load, and we always had enough. When we loaded up, we always left room for one more, and that's in case when one goes down in a pen, you can shift one out and you've got room to work to get them back up again. But we did quite a lot of trips like that.
Initially, the Maguires had no direct means of communication with the outside world. They were told that in the case of emergency, send up a smoke signal.
And that was our advice. If was in trouble, to light 3 fires on this highest hill down there. But we never had to do it. So the only way we got supplies was when a boat was coming to drop something off or someone off, or there was no air crafts at that time, and I don't know, we just never, I suppose we killed our own meat, and Pat had a garden started before I went there, so we had vegetables, and we just took a quantity of supplies with us. There wouldn't have been any other way. Georgie French was good to us because he had lived on the island. He'd lived there. They'd lived there for 7 years. So, and I don't think he ever went off it when he was a kid. So he sort of knew what it was like to live there. And if he could help, he would. You know, he'd drop us in something if we wanted it.
Like the Maguires, the Allistons on 3 Hummock Island had to resort to smoke signals in time of emergency.
Warwick, was 6 months old, got interception of the bow, and what you do is you light 3 signal fires on Signal Hill, and you keep the fire going until a boat sees, and it comes, and it will take the baby to hospital. And so we did just that, and we lit fires and stoked them up all day, and we saw the boat over at another island about 7 miles away, and it went on straight past, didn't turn until 8 o'clock that night, when we threw some paraffin on the fire at last out of desperation.
Fortunately, the Jean Nichols was passing, saw the smoke, and was able to take mother and child to Stanley.
People said, well, are you going to continue to live on this island? You haven't got much medical attention out there. And my parents said, yes, we will. We're going to stay there. And so they basically passed that first test of nerve to go on living in isolation.
Communications were revolutionised soon after, when both families bought 2-way radios.
Our only communication was Hobart radio. We had skeds twice a day on that. So we'd send telegrams to the grocer in Stanley, and they'd put it on a boat or drop it off. But we never seemed to run out of that much, really. But
Well, when we used to take the stores to Hunter Island, you would use your dinghy to take it in, so therefore you couldn't take anything real heavy because the dinghy wouldn't carry that much.
A passage on the Jean Nichols was the normal means of transport, a matter which could require some patience.
that was the only boat we travelled on till we got our own little one, was the Jean Nichols. We'd go out of Stanley or come into Stanley on the Jean, but sometimes we'd be going to come off with it. They'd be picking us up at such and such a time and not have all the kids down the bay, and we'd be ready and excited. And we would wait and wait and wait, and when we'd go back, he'd be probably going around the corner to Stanley. He'd said, we'll pick you up next time. There was all those sort of things happen. You know, it was very hard to take because you'd be ready to go off, and no, wait for next time. So
Finally, a timber jetty was built, which was a major benefit to the Maguires and Nichols alike.
Quite a large wooden jetty there. The G. Nichols used to come alongside. That stayed there for years. Well, that was a good thing when we got that in there, but it was pretty hard. Would have been hard to build because it was all over rock, and they had to be. I remember Mum and Dad drilling holes in the rocks with a rock drill. You know, Mum holding the drill. I suppose us kids would be looking after the other kids or getting bit by March fire. I remember Mum down there holding this rock drill, or Dad was tapping the. You know, you'd have to drill inch holes. It'd be all day to drill a hole, wouldn't it? Just a bit. Dipping the dirt out with a little hooky thing and put a bit of water. You have to put a bit of tin of water in them while you drill them. You know, to fasten it down to the rock. But anyway, that was a handy thing, that wharf.
When we got the wharf done, it was very, very good. You could go in there with 2 or 3 tonne of super and whatever and switch it off, pick it up, put it on the wharf and go away. It made it much, much better. Much, much better.
The lifestyles of the Maguires and Allistons, with their young families, continued to run almost in parallel when they both achieved greater independence in the mid-1980s by buying a boat each. Maguires was only 26 feet and named Miss Hunter. The Allistons was a larger boat, which they renamed Straitsman. This enabled the family to commute to Stanley or Smithton and call on each other occasionally. When this photo was taken, the Allistons were visiting the Maguires, being brought up from Cave Bay by tractor and trailer. Their boating adventures were not without challenges.
The most serious one I remember was the famous carrot trip where we'd decided to add to our income by planting a field of carrots, and we loaded them on the ship, and we got out into the waters between Three Hummock and Smithton, and we got an almighty southwesterly gale, and the ballast shifted in the bottom of the boat, and so we were sailing at a list. Seemed like 45 degrees. It was really quite a serious list. Could have capsized us, and we worked like demons to get the slabs of pig iron back into the centre of the boat again. But when we got to Smithton, the salt spray had been so thorough that no one would buy the carrots. So that was a bit of a shame, but it was, we were glad to have ourselves alive, I guess.
As Cave Bay was wide open to easterly gales, Miss Hunter had to be hauled out each time after use.
It wasn't any good at all on the sea. Dad wasn't, because he'd been reared up the back of Nabagina. He didn't know he was that hopeless on the sea for a start. But by the time he'd finished, he was pretty handy. Like, he could put her on the slip there with a bit of roll on in the night time. You know, like on the Cave Bay there, and that slipway. I've seen him going in there with easily with a fair roll on, and he had her all rigged up so she'd catch, and he'd come in at her. When he first started, he didn't know. Yeah, he was bloody terrified. He was nervous of it, but once he got confidence, he was. And you could get down there. Most southwesterly weather, because you get in behind all them banks down to the petrels. Once you got to the petrels and go across behind that big sandbank, and easterly was worse. We had to go when the weather was a little bit on the southwesterly side of things before you find up too much and come bloody easterly.
The next major step forward was the acquisition of a landing barge by each family in the late 60s.
And up to that point, he'd been struggling, you know, with freight, because it was a big part of your income would have been going in carting cattle off, and, you know, held it back, couldn't get super, but once he got that barge, and just coincided with a period when cattle were worth a lot of money, he really kicked on there for a few years, you know, like got himself some good machinery, and we ended up buying farm up mainland here. He ended up buying his father's farm out in Morbana, so then we had to set up where we was bringing the younger stock off the island and fattening them ourselves, where before you was at the mercy of the buyer.
The Allistons' landing barge greatly facilitated the movement of stock and machinery. The Maguires gradually improved the amenities on the island. A new home was built and a wind generator installed for electricity. Trixie adapted to the isolation of island life, bringing up 6 children in the ensuing years.
I've always probably liked my own company and probably still do to a certain thing. When you're young, it doesn't seem to matter. I wouldn't have liked to know I was there for the duration we did put in there, because I was horrified that Mrs. French lived there for 7 years. We were there for 34, I think. So I don't think I'd have went if I'd have known that. So, but I didn't. What you don't know doesn't hurt you. So it was a good place to rear children. That was rather, having to send them away to boarding school was probably the hardest thing to do. But, and they never liked it either. So.
The freedom of island life suited the children.
I always wanted to go fishing. Even as a kid, I loved fishing. Not so much the fishing, I just liked the boat, sea life, like the boat playing in water, creeks and...
A wonderland for us. We were totally untramelled. We didn't have to tell anyone where we were going. We just walked all over the island, which, as you know, is quite big. We spent a lot of time in the dinghy, rowing around the rocks, fishing and discovering new places.
The transport of passengers and stores was revolutionised in the 60s with the construction of an airstrip and the arrival of the famous Billy Vincent in his Oster.
Once Bill Vincent, got the plane and was there, and we could pick him up. And not only that, it changed. It's like he wouldn't fly over there without dropping you the paper, and you got your mail. Well, we used to go 3 months without any mail before that.
When you went to Hunter Island, Trixie normally knew that I was coming that way, or if I wasn't, I'd be dropping the paper or something. And she would always put on a slide of scones. And by the time I landed at the strip and walked 500 metres from the strip over to the homestead, when you got there, you'd have hot scones and jam and cream and lovely cup of tea. And
so the plane actually did change our lives. That it was more, you could come off when you wanted to, sort of thing.
Bill and his plane were equally as important to the Allistons on Three Hummock Island, the more so as they grew older.
Mrs. Eleanor Allison has lived on Three Hummock Island with her husband John for 30 years. Every day Bill swoops like an eagle to drop her mailbag, and once a week he calls in to bring supplies. How important is he?
Well, I think he's vital to our staying here, really. It's hard to admit that, but it is probably true.
Frank Jager and myself, we wouldn't take anything for doing small jobs for them. And they used to pay us in veggies, and they were lovely. And he said, you take them home now and you don't cook them, you eat them raw.
Eleanor Alliston made a reputation for herself as a writer. Her first book highlighted her island experiences and was appropriately titled Escape to an Island. The second was Island Affair. These were followed by 5 Mills and Boon novels. Her notoriety engendered outside interest, resulting in visits to the island by people making documentary films and newsreels. These included A Big Country, Bill Peach's Australia, The Mike Walsh Show and Wicker's World from the UK.
We sort of had this saying, it's time for island publicity again. The storymongers are upon us. I think we rather enjoyed it. Being sort of photographed and that sort of thing, it seemed to be sort of an interesting style of life to have, and became quite common for us to do that.
The danger of snakes was ever present in a mother's mind, especially given the time and distance to medical help.
Paddy before he went away to school, I think, he had a mania for killing the snakes. And I wouldn't know about it because they used to go off on a horse, the 3 kids on one horse. I can remember Pat coming home and he found one hanging on a fence, still alive. Paddy had stunned it or something and had picked it up and put it on the fence. And I did pull one out of a mutton-bird burrow backwards one day when I was catching mutton birds. And I soon let that go, and us kids did. I think Huey had one crawl out past his shoulder while he was birding there once. But there's plenty of snakes there, there's no doubt about it.
The Allistons had a quite different attitude towards snakes.
Right at the very start, my mother got us in the kitchen and said, "No, this thing about snakes. The island has a lot of snakes, and the main thing that you've got to do as a child is to avoid them. So don't attempt to kill them. It wasn't our policy. We liked them, and that was an important thing for us to get into our minds that snakes will only attack you if they feel that you're being aggressive." So that got rid of a huge danger spot for my mother.
From early accounts, the islands were scrubby when Europeans arrived, interspersed with patches of native grassland on which stock could be grazed. Limited areas were cultivated and exotic grasses planted, but they could only become viable pastoral leases by the use of fire to retard the growth of scrub and promote the fresh young regrowth for grazing animals, imitating what the Aborigines had been doing for thousands of years.
Yeah, well, I know my father burnt everything that ever... He bought matches in the cartons and give us kids all the matches we could put in our pockets when the weather... and ride around a horse and light them off the horse. But everything that ever burnt, he burnt it, like kept it open.
Every paddock that was fired would be fired about every 3 years. That would give the cattle and sheep a bit of green pick in the spring, and because we weren't able to conserve fodder, that was very important.
But it got to the stage in the finish where you couldn't burn it, actually. A lot of it wouldn't burn, like a lot of the big patches of scrub, never had enough to run fires into them to burn them. And once he started building good fences, he got a little bit nervous about lighting fires as well, because they'd burn his fences, and it did get away. It did start to grow up even the last time while he was there. Scrub started to come back again. But it's really, if it ever gets on fire at the right time of the year now, there'll be a massive fire all over it. It's grown up again now. All that island has. I think Hummocks has too.
Granite Hill, from Anchor and Chimney Corner, that Granite Hill, that was all beautiful, grazy, and now it's just scrub. It's actually the same at the Shepherd's Bay, on the Hunter Island. That was all clear all through there from Shepherd's Bay right through there. And now, God, you scrub.
In 2013, Hunter Island was again in Maguire family management after a lapse of 20 years. 2 days after this interview was taped, there were 3 separate fires burning on Hunter Island. One a prescribed burn, the others unlawfully lit. Three Hummock Island is now a nature reserve, except for a small area around the 3 houses, which are rented out as holiday accommodation by the lessees. Mutton-birding, which is the harvesting for human consumption of fledgling short-tailed shearwaters, has long been the preserve of the Straitsmen, whose ancestors were Aboriginal women and itinerant sealers of the Bass Strait Islands. Nowadays, these people prefer to identify as Aboriginal or Indigenous Australians. While the Furneaux group of islands in the Eastern Straits was the centre of activity, islands in the Hunter group were also birded. Parts of 3 Hummock, Hunter and Steep Island had rookeries, but Trefoil was the main birding island of the group. In 1951, the Nicholls sold the lease of 3 Hummock Island and bought Trefoil Island freehold. Lots of people, stores and gear had to be taken to the island at the beginning of the 6-week season in mid-March.
Well, with the birders on trefoil, we used to pick them up at Woolnorth and take them across to trefoil, row them all on, row them all off, all their gear and everything. And then they would disperse and go to whatever hut, because they had 3 huts there in the finish. But no, we had them all aboard the boat there one night. We couldn't get rid of them. No, we couldn't get rid of them because the weather was bad. Well, you can know what it'd be like with about 30 birders. Yeah, but they were good. I used to enjoy going ashore, you know, and having a bit of fun with them and talking to them, because the more you act the gape with them, the more they'd work. They would. But they were, we cutted a hell of a lot of mutton birds off there when Bob Luck was there. And when I was running the boat, we had, I think it was nearly 50,000 fresh birds we'd brought off for the season. But he knocked us off. He said, Walter, he said, you better stop. He said, otherwise, he said, I won't have enough to go in my casks. Yeah, but we used to go from Woolnorth across every morning or every afternoon and get the mutton birds.
So they'd be fresh ones?
Fresh ones.
And then they'd be salting others?
Yeah, oh yes, when they salt them, it used to be a pleasure to watch them.
The fitter men would be employed bringing the birds in from rookeries, while men, women and children did the processing and salting of the birds into casks.
And they're packed into the barrels. They used to start at the bottom. Naturally, they'd start at the bottom, wouldn't they? And they'd go round and round like that. Yeah, round and round and round. And they would get 400 or 500 in a cask. And then they're get them up, make sure that they're full, and leave them overnight until they sink down. Then put a few more in it. Then put the lid on and knock the hoops down. Roll it out onto the beach, onto the cobblestones. And then bung up, bilge free. Then they get the water, salt water out of the sea, and the potato. Put the potato in it and keep adding until the potato floats. Then they go around all the casks that they've got lined up from yesterday, and they'll pour the salt water in, then keep adding a little bit all day because it's soaking down. And then when it comes out, be the next day perhaps, when it comes out a nice reddy colour, she's nearly ready to do. And then a little gets a bit on the redder side. Then they got the plug, generally with a piece of bag, cut and just put there and then bang, hit the thing. But they don't drive it home until they've checked it 2 or 3 times the next day, and that till they make sure that it's right. Then they're rolled down to when we at trefoil, we had the dinghy that would come in. It was a flatty, bit bigger than the one that you've been looking at. And we used to have sheer legs, you know, to roll them up. First, we had no motive power. We used to have to row them, which was very difficult. And it was a slow job down there because there was always plenty of tide. They were a good lot of mutton birders, they were a good lot. Billy Green, he got £100 for the season, and in the later years they used to pay him on the island, you know. And he had lost his damn money by the time we got to the petrels. Plant poker, they were, £5 for cards. Oh, dearie me. But Lloyd, he was the best dam worker that I ever had, you know, or we ever had, and you couldn't rely on him. That was the trouble. He'd get on the beer. That was it.
This was a period of transition from salting birds to flying them out fresh.
Paddy Maguire birded for me for about 15 years. From the time he was about a 10-year-old, and then he went off to school. Every school holidays he'd come home, and I was paying him 5 cents a bird, I think. And I can't remember what it was costing me. We were operating that oyster at £2.10 an hour, and we could fuel it and maintain it, and we're still making about 75% profit out of it back in those days.
Like I say, I worked commercial mutton birding after I left school, catching with Billy Vincent, and that was good for us kids, like us boys, because just catching 14,000 birds a season. Like when I first started, the first year I caught 8 bags a day, which was 8 for 240 a day for a plain load, fresh one, start daylight, just catch them and gurry them and chuck them in a heap. And the next 2 years I caught 400 a day, which was a big day. 400 birds a day, 35 days for the whole season. You'd night bird. You start night bird when the birds started coming out around about the 20th, but that was just as hard as day bird, you know. One night I caught 54 bags by myself, which is 54 by 4, whatever that is. It's over 2,000 birds, and I'd caught most of them before midnight, night bird.
Ran the mutton bird contract for 29 years, and that all the birds for most of the time came from Hunter Island. I mean, in the first year that the oyster, my brother and myself went and we'd catch 9 bags, and then he'd be on top, so that was the equivalent to about 12 or 13 bags, and the poor old oyster would stagger out of Hunter Island like a sick duck, but we always got them home okay. And in the first season we processed 2,200. We'd fly them in, clean them, take them around town and sell them, and then every other day that would happen. And at the end of the season we'd processed 2,200, we thought it was a big time. And then the second year we processed 22,000. And then the last year on Hunter Island, working the Homestead Rookery and the North End Rookery, we processed I think it was 76,000, and we took another 20,000 off Walker's Island, so we processed 90-odd thousand.
In addition to their birding interests, the Nicholls ran sheep on Trefoil Island for a time.
We went over from the hummocks the first time that we went there. Would you think that we could get 18 sheep in that damn dinghy, that flatty? They were coasting, you know, they get coasted. 160 odd we took over.
Coastie, or Coast's disease, in stock, is caused by a lack of the trace elements cobalt and copper in the diet. This causes stock to become weak and poor in condition. Boating sheep ashore in a dinghy was not without its challenges.
There's one fella in the flatty and the other handed him down. As soon as he gets hold of that one, he sits him round like that, on of a fort, with his legs like that. And then the other bloke gets down there, stands there, righto. I was the one doing the packing. And they started down, and then you hold it, put the next one there like that, then you spread yourself out a bit. And we could get about 3 across like that. Well then, and then you got to be like, I don't know what, to hold them there, to row them ashore, but they was weak, coasty as hell. But that was their stock for starts. And we had a horse. We took down later on a horse, and it was a half-draft thing. It was over on the hummocks. Put him aboard at the hummocks, put him alongside the rigging and tied him there, you know, and he had a good trip over, going beautiful. And we had other gear to unload, and we're unloading him. And I was down in the dinghy, that flat down dinghy. I was down in the dinghy. Mr. Nichols lifted him up, just so it's cleared the bulwarks, you see. Of course, then I'd have to give it a push. And Colin Smedley was with me. He was in the flatty, and he's holding the halter line. And look, we pushed it, and Mr. Nichols started to lower, and of course started to lower, and as soon as he stopped, the bloody horse went down, bang, straight into the water. And I said, you've broken the what do we call it? I forget now. It was broken, and Mr. Nichols said, "What, Walter?" He said, "It ought to be all right." He should have come off the Aristides, and the Aristides was wrecked in 1940. Yeah, oh, gee, I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that as long as I live.
Well, that'd be a close call, wouldn't it?
Oh, would if he had a fell in the boat, he would have went. But and then, of course, we had to row him ashore, and I'm rowing, and Colin's hanging onto him, and the bloody thing, he just laid on his side like that, and he never attempted to swim, and nothing at all. You got no idea. Oh dear God, hard way to earn a quid.
The list of ships wrecked on King Island in Bass Strait is legendary. Till the late 1800s, it was frequented only by sealers, wallaby snarers, and shipwrecked mariners. Boats servicing the island were mostly small ketchers and cutters. Up till 1972, Curry was its main port. In reality, little more than a bleak cove on a wild and rugged coast. A difficult port for sailing craft to service, especially in winter. The wind needed to be fair, with not too much swell, as heavy swell could close the entrance for days at a time. Its entrance channel between visible and sunken rocks leaves little room for error, especially for large traders, as a quick turn to starboard midway requires an immediate response. From this photo of the War Hope, on rocks at the edge of the channel, it appears she did not respond quickly enough. It is probably no coincidence that the beginning of the island's development in the late 1800s coincided with increasing numbers of little steamships capable of giving a reasonably reliable service. The largest steamer to berth at the Curry Wharf was the 400-ton Tambar. Auxiliary ketchers and schooners continued to trade to Curry till the late 1950s, often with difficulty, losing up to 60 days a year waiting to either get in or out of the port.
It was a difficult place from the run from Tasmania across to Curry, because sometimes you could never get around Stokes's Point because the tide and the sea was that great. For a ship with the size of the Margaret Thwaites, and you wouldn't make it. And that, and the weather conditions, nor'westerly, you get into Curry with a nor'wester because that was down the coast. But once it went anything west of northwest, well, that was a shut-off point. And because I think I've been up to about 10 or 12 days anchored over there, waiting to get into Curry for the sea to die down, because when the sea used to break in the Curry entrance, that's when you just couldn't get in. I'd anchor up in New Year Island. I used to anchor in just on the eastern side of New Year Island. There was a good anchorage there. And then at the times there I'd be anchored in Grassy Harbour. There was a grassy bay there, little grassy bay. I'd be anchored in there. once the sea made around Stokes's, even in the Lowatta, we got down there and we'd been up as far as Surprise Point, you know, Surprise Bay, that's on the, and we just come to a standstill because you just couldn't punch the sea, you know, like we didn't, well, we wouldn't have had we weren't big enough, and the sea was so great that you just give it away, you see, we just couldn't make it, and once it started to break at Nellaby Point on the passage into the Curry Harbour, that finished us, you see, you know, and lots of times there we'd turn around and we'd go back up north again, go right around the island, up to New Year and just anchor there, and as soon as the wind would go south-west or southerly, down we'd go down the coast then into around Nellaby Point and then into Curry.
During summer, gales rarely last longer than 3 days, but in winter they can blow for weeks at a time, daunting for the little 56-foot Jean Nichols.
We had a very, very bad trip. We loaded here and went to down to the hummocks, and the weather was bad. We mucked about for a damn week before we could get across to Grassy, and then we had fuel and that on this time, and then we couldn't. We had to go north about, and we were exactly a fortnight. And we came home in about 10 hours and 50 minutes. Oh, blew a bloody gale from the northwest. Out even, and it was dark when we was out here off North Point. And Mr. Nichols said to me, well, you better go and take the staysail off her. And when I went up the staysail, I wasn't there. I was gone. Yeah, that was the longest trip we ever had. It was this time of the year.
While the Jean Nichols was only a few years old and still a sound vessel, the same could not be said for some of the older ketchers in the trade. A case in point was the loss of the Willwatch on a voyage from Ulverston to Curry in 1958. She was then 63 years old and had prior seaworthiness issues with survey authorities.
King Island, you had to know the weather. All the skippers, the masters of the boats that run to King Island, they knew the weather, and they didn't. Lots of times between gales, the weather eased down between 4 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock in the morning. There was a sort of a lull. Now, Mac was he was the master of the Willwatch, and I think what he tried to do, his boat was leaking, but his pumps could hold it, and he tried to get to King Island in that period, and he didn't make it. Once she went down by the head, and once she went down by the head, his pumps weren't any good to him because his pumps were in the engine room, and she had a steel bulkhead in her, I think, and if I remember right, in the forward between the forecastle and the cargo hold was a steel bulkhead, and that once that filled up with water, that there was no way of getting the water down there to the pump.
What made the loss of the Willwatch particularly poignant was the fact that she was fitted with a radio so that the master was able to give a blow-by-blow description of his own and his crew's tragic end.
She was an old boat, and she sprung a plank or lost the caulking out of it, and she sunk forward, and the pumps couldn't drain the water out of her because she was down by the head so much. But it was a southerly gale, and we had the radios on and everything in those times, and then the last words was she was going, gone. And he said the crew is, prior to that, he said the crew is over the stern in the dinghy, and we presumed that the dinghy was still tied to to the wheel watch when she went down, and she pulled the dinghy down with it. And Vic and Doug Warren was out in the area. Well, they went to the area and they found just flotsam and something. Never found anything of the crew.
Freighting cargo across the exposed waters of Western Bass Strait was a big task for little wooden ships. And at just 56 feet or 17 metres, the Jean Nichols was the smallest left in the trade in the 1950s. She carried livestock, timber and fuel in 44-gallon drums.
Yeah, 92 drums to King Island, 27 drums of diesel, that's 44-gallon drums down below, and the rest on deck. One trip that I'd been on the wheel going across, it was hard easterly, and she was going along all right. And Mr Nichols, we're just past Reed's Rocks, and Mr Nichols came up and said, "I'll give you a spell, Walter." I said, "Righto." And so I was sleeping aft then, and I went down in and got into my bunk, and I wasn't in there 10 minutes, and the next minute she rolled to port. Over she went to port, and there was a vase that were on the wall. It had been there ever since the boat was built. It was only a little vase, and the nail, you know, on an angle like that. Well, that vase went off and banged over on the seat alongside Mr Nichols's bunk. And the next thing I heard him say, "Walter, come up here." So up I went. He said, "Have a look astern." So I opened the door and sliding out and I have a look. He said, "What can you see?" I said, "I can see a damn drum." He said, "Yes, Walter." He said, "Now have a look where it come from." And we used to carry 5 alongside the wheelhouse on each side, and it had taken out the middle one on the port side, clean and clever. Went over there like that. Oh, she was a good one. She went over all right.
A long jetty was completed at Narracoopa on the east coast in 1916. This had the benefit of being sheltered from the prevailing westerly winds, its drawback being that it was wide open to easterly gales. It handled a lot of cargo, but its distance from Curry was a difficulty. Cargo was unloaded at Curry in the time-honoured method of lifting it off piece by piece with the ship's derrick. But in 1963, the modern 350-tonne King Islander entered the trade to Curry. This steel vessel featured opening bow doors, allowing quicker roll-on, roll-off cargo handling. In 1972, matters were further improved when an all-weather port of Grassy Harbour was developed with the construction of a breakwater and roll-on, roll-off berth. This coincided with the introduction of the 1,000-tonne stern-loading Straitsman, which provided a triangular Melbourne, Stanley, King Island weekly service. For the first time, the island had a reliable shipping service running to a timetable. Various vessels have since been employed on this run, which now usually call at Devonport instead of Stanley.